When Hannah Arendt, when she talks about forgiveness, she said that even though forgiveness was developed in the concept of Christianity, there's no reason to foresee the political considerations. But anyway, my question was somewhere else. In the text, you talk about this concept that was very interesting for me. Adioforization, something like that. Adioforization. And when the conversations, I don't know if I'm saying right, maybe somebody has it. You recognize the concept? Yeah. Okay, because I mean, anyway, some of the conversations talk about how the administrative, managerial, or I thought that it was in some way related to Hannah Arendt's development of domination, but it seems like there was a sense that some of the maldad, evil in the world is related to the fact that people don't see themselves implicated in the actions they do. That there's some distance that somehow allows them to do things that they don't see quite close, their consequence. And I found that concept in particular very interesting in this level, in this discussion, because as you were discussing this morning, it seems that the digital world even exacerbates that possibility, the possibility that we are even further away. I mean, the example that we were talking, I think in the conversation, was related to the Holocaust and how the whole bureaucratic system allow people to do things that they saw themselves removed from they saw themselves a way to assume responsibility. But I think that the digital world might even exacerbate that situation. So I would, and then in the same thought, they even make it more hard to develop an ethics, a sense of responsibility and commitment and entitlement to that. I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, exactly.
I just wanted you to
it's a fabulous question. Totally agree. And we were also talking at lunchtime about literature and the literature of surveillance, and that I'm going to answer your question, but I also think it's important to bring in the literary studies and to think about the ways in which literature and film can inform the conversation in very profound ways. The conversation about surveillance. Just writing myself some notes so I remember. Okay. So adioforization is the rather clumsy concept that Zygmunt Bauman uses to talk about the ways in which the moral implications of actions are distanced from the actions, so that it becomes more difficult to recognize the moral dimension of some action or process or practice or system. It's less and less easy to recognize that situation as one that has moral responsibility associated with it. I should say in passing that I think that a better guide to that process is in the work of Charles Taylor. Those of you in political philosophy will probably have come across Taylor's work, perhaps in the context of the politics of recognition. But I'm thinking of his very large book called A Secular Age. And it's a fascinating study, and I commend it to you. And I think it's a very important study, and many people are discussing the work of Taylor because he is pushing back historically and looking at modernity in terms that help explain in other cultural frames how that adiaphorization process that Bauman talks about occurs. So while I think Bauman is important and I think his insights are great, myself I'd want to bring Taylor into the story as well. I think his things and his work is very important. T-A-Y-L-O-R, Charles Taylor. You might know his book Sources of the Self. That was the other very big book that he produced. Sources of the Self. And the one that I'm referring to is, what did you say it was called?
Secular.
Yes, the Secular Age. Exactly.
Sources of the Self.
Sources of the Self.
The Self.
That was his earlier book, but the new one builds on it. I say new, it came out in 2008. Just realised that I never got to part 2 of the question that was asked by my friend who's now left. I was asked about contested concepts. Oh well, sorry, I forgot that part altogether. Okay, diaphorization. Yeah, so the connection with Arendt and the origins of totalitarianism and concept of domination and so on. Yes, I think that's really very important. Arendt's, and I think actually even more Bauman's treatment of the Holocaust is totally relevant to our discussion. Not that in a post-Snowden world we have somehow, we're now confronting already something that looks like a Holocaust, but rather that the principles about which Arendt spoke and Bauman speaks are ones that are embedded in the present. So I don't want to turn it into an alarmist exaggeration of current conditions, but what's behind the argument I think is crucial. Okay, so Arendt in the origins of totalitarianism and more in Eichmann in Jerusalem argued about what she called the banality of evil. It's in the book, but if you've seen the film, it's also in the film. I thought the film was great.
Yes,
very, very cool too. I just thought that it captured things so neatly. Anyway, so in there, she spoke about the ways in which, well, of course, what got her into trouble was arguing the ways in which the Jewish leaders themselves were complicit in allowing a Holocaust to happen, and that's what really made her a controversial figure. But, you know, look at the record, I think she was right. But anyway, that's another story. I think that her showing how in the ordinary routines of activity within a bureaucratic organization, including the bureaucratic organization of the death camps, you see the ordinary decisions being made, and including, in relation to what I said this morning, efficiency. Efficiency was one of the criteria for making the death camps work. And so, even more than in Arendt's work, I think, in Bauman's work, you see the continuity of modern themes. So his Modernity and the Holocaust, personally, I regard as his greatest book. If it wasn't his greatest book, it was certainly the watershed. It's the book where things change in his thinking, and he starts to emphasize certain themes even more after Modernity and the Holocaust. I think it's a very important book. But what he's pointing out is that it's in the ordinary routines of everyday life, doing what the manager says we ought to do next, completing the files, associating this file with that file. It's in the ordinary everyday decisions that are just, this is the way the organization works, for goodness sakes. Why should we do anything different? This is the way I was asked to do it. The department above me expected me to do it this way. Just those ordinary, everyday life decisions. And again, sorry, but I have to mention Edward Snowden, because Edward Snowden speaks the same way about what happens in the NSA. Listen to him describing his colleagues and what they do in the room around the terminal when they see something, oh, that's interesting, and they gather around. You can imagine the young male white techies standing around the machine and saying, oh, that's interesting. Let's see what happens when we, oh, that gives us a different pattern. And you can just hear them making their little everyday, banal comments about what's going on. It's just the way that they work in the organization. They're young tech enthusiasts, just like Snowden. They're working within a system that they're happy to be working in. They can show that they are patriotic Americans. They are earning a living, doing what they love, goofing off with computers. I mean, it's just ordinary life. We all know people like that, and they're just doing their thing. And this is exactly the point that Arendt makes, and then I think Bauman makes even more strongly in Modernity and the Holocaust. It was the extraordinary ordinariness of what you were doing that produced and maintained the Holocaust. I think it's an astonishing book.
Yes, the kind of criminal.
It really helps us, because you can see exactly, as I say, if you listen to Snowden, you can hear him talking about those characters doing their little thing, producing mass surveillance, putting people like Faisal Gill under special scrutiny. You can hear the same sort of thing happen. And the Holocaust was never, ever inevitable. It was never, ever unavoidable. Nothing forced it to happen. There were always alternatives. But that part of Bauman's point is that they were already into that kind of bureaucratic mentality which had diaphorized their situations, their involvement, and so on and so forth. In other words, removed the moral content. So, of course, as a concentration camp commandant, you could go home to your wife and children at the end of the day, play with the children, listen to your Beethoven, and in the daytime, go back to the camp and switch the gas machines on. It was all part of a consistent little world that didn't appear to be anomalous because it had been diaphorized through the bureaucratic mentality. And so that's what I think Arendt and then Bauman do so brilliantly, to talk about the ordinariness of it all. But it's a huge, huge red warning light, I think, for us, that we observe the ordinariness of the organizations that we work for, that produce these surveillant contexts from which we have allowed ourselves to remove the moral responsibility within the situation. So, you know, I think that Arendt and especially Bauman are really important in this. Does the digital world exacerbate it? Well, of course it does, because it automates the situation. It makes it possible for us to continue doing the same things without being directly involved ourselves. It automates it. I suggest several other things in the little book on surveillance after Snowden. I show how the Snowden, the surveillance that Snowden has revealed shows a huge dependence on what is now called big data. Big data, data analytics. The use of massive amounts of minuscule forms of data and using algorithms to sort through them and to create surveillance consequences. So I look at the ways in which exactly your question is worked out, how it exacerbates that diaphorization process. So yeah, that's important. Does it mean that we... Yes, I think it does make it more difficult to produce a new ethic, but it certainly doesn't make it impossible. And what we need, and this is why I come back to your literary friends, why we need those metaphors and those understandings from a fictional world of literary and filmic productions. And I was mentioning Dave Eggers' novel, The Circle, which is, I think, a brilliant novel relating to post-Snowden type surveillance, except it's all in a corporate context. Not all. The government is actually already doing really what the corporation wants. It's a very realistic novel in that sense. Came out last year. It's just called The Circle. The author's name is Dave Eggers, E-G-G-E-R-S, Dave Eggers. And I mentioned that there's a brilliant review of Eggers' book by Margaret Atwood, who herself wrote a brilliant surveillance dystopia, The Handmaid's Tale. But she does a super critical review of Eggers' book, but she sees that it's a fine piece of literature too. He draws on many other surveillance dystopias to create what appears to be, it's a bit like Huxley, Brave New World. Everything is great because everything is transparent, and there's a dystopia in there. Anyway, I think what we can do is, among other things, see what the literature, what the film produces, and learn, distill from that ethics that are appropriate to the people who are engaged in this world. The Circle, by the way, is the corporation in Silicon Valley that has taken over Facebook, Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, every other corporation you can think of. The Circle now encloses everything that was once lots of corporations. So just as Google would really like to do just that, The Circle has done it in the novel. And it's a novel that's really worth reading because it hits on so many of these themes, but from the perspective of someone who has clear insight into it. So I think the question of new ethics or whatever, I think the literary and the filmic helps us to see the importance. So just like Enemy of the State or Minority Report or Brazil or whatever other surveillance movie you meant, Gattaca. There's so many good surveillance movies that raise issues that you hadn't really thought about to the surface in an entertaining way. So the novels also. So I think there's a connection between the kinds of metaphors that the literary and filmic producers make. The kind of work that they do helps us with new metaphors that informs also possibility of new ethical tools for enabling us to see things more clearly and to speak out in relation to. Anyway, more questions?
Yes, it's my turn. I put myself in the list.
No te vigilamos, Madeline, no te vigilamos.
This is an evidence-producing technology.
Well, this is. I want to bring another angle of reflection that has to do with ethics too, and is what I think we have to continue to reflect upon, which is the relationship between surveillance and the development of technique. Because at some point we also will have to assume responsibility for that development. Because, as you said, we are talking about machines that record the use of itself. So I was thinking that this reflection, we can put this reflection in dialogue with that literature that talk about non-trivial machines that have self-referentiality, And when you said that you were mentioning this word of the woman that yeah, the one that talks about an information that has been that have lost its connection with the embodied individuals. I think that that's what is happening. That there is a system of information that has a movement of its own, and it is completely detached from these discussions on ethics and how, at the end, that kind of development of the technique is a development that we contribute to make it. So for me, when you were saying that so the information that is gathered is not me, but the made-up me, it's interesting also because at one point in one of your books you said that contemporary surveillance developed not by resting on images but on information, which for me that means that certain kind of concepts that we tend to use in order to analyze that phenomena, images, representation, are not longer capable of attending this complexity, which is really a different one.
So is that a question?
Yes, it's a comment.
It's a good comment though, and it's interesting you should use the word technique too, because it's interesting to me because, back to your question, back in the 1960s, the work of Jacques Ellul was all to do with La Technique, and he wrote this book called The Technological Society, and he too was a Christian ethicist. It's interesting to me, he had some very interesting insights, and he was, he was quite open about the kind of Christian, the ways in which his Christian commitments informed his social scientific practice, and his arguments about the technological society were years ahead in terms of understanding surveillance. He was the first person to argue that once you start to encourage policing agencies to reduce their personnel and to increase their automation, the more they would have to rely on surveillance, and surveillance would become sort of self-fulfilling growth within policing. And so he was one of the first to argue that surveillance was going to be a negative outcome within, well, mass surveillance of a particular kind was going to become a negative outcome of that process of trying to increase efficiency among police. Anyway, that's a little technique. Your, yeah, the things for which we have to take responsibility. I think it's a really complex issue, and I think it comes out in quite other ways as well as the ones that we've been talking about. I think, for example, of the use of drones. Now, yeah, so these are aerial vehicles, like planes, that have no pilot inside the plane. It's a bit like the panopticon. There's no inspector there, but hey, you've got to think there's an inspector there. In this case, they're piloted from the ground, and some of them can be automated as well, so that they can actually fulfill their mission without direct intervention during flight. Now, everybody has heard about the drones that have been used in so-called Middle Eastern countries by American operators working from Nevada, California, and whatnot. And that, of course, raises the question about how you take responsibility within technique. And there's work being done on post-traumatic stress disorder among the operators who have recognized what they're doing. You know, they're sitting at their keyboard manipulating a mouse, which is actually killing people thousands of kilometers away. That is the in-your-face military use. But all drones are surveillance. And that's one of the things that distinguishes them. Because whether or not it is just a surveillance drone with no weapons, or if it's a drone that is armed, they are all surveillance because they all depend on remote vision, remote automated artificial vision. So they have to see what they are doing in order to do it. And as I say, some of them can be completely automated. But it's a very interesting development in surveillance, visual surveillance, because the cameras that we have been used to until now have been terrestrial, that is to say they're fixed on the ground, or they're fixed on buildings or whatever, but they're fixed to terra firma. And they are also fixed in the sense that they are in one place. But drone surveillance is both above the ground and completely mobile. And so, yeah, it's a very interesting development, but it raises hugely this question about taking responsibility. How do you take responsibility for an automated machine? How do you even take responsibility when the pilot is in constant contact with it, operating the thing? What difference does the remoteness make? And here, personally, I think that the work of someone like Emmanuel Levinas is really important, and of course Bauman depends on Levinas as well. And importantly, Jacques Derrida as well. Derrida is, I think, excellent on this stuff, especially the graveside eulogy for Levinas when he died. I don't know if you know that book, but Adieu, Emmanuel. It's an incredible treatment, but it's exactly on this theme. The difference between hospitalité, hostilité, and what human responsabilité is in those situations. And really, I think that Derrida's work building on Levinas is so relevant to this question. You know, anyway, I think that those kinds of, so that's another route into the ethics. In this case, a sort of Jewish ethics that doesn't actually say it's Jewish ethics, but that how can the care for the other be expressed when the other is thousands of kilometers away and you aren't quite sure what is actually happening? Because like all these systems, and Snowden also talks about this, like all these systems, you can't rely on them. They don't necessarily do what the instruction manual says they will do. They're not reliable. And so, you know, the question of technological reliability, responsibility of the person running the machine, all those questions, I think are raised acutely by things like drones. But I also think that the discussion of drones can help us think about the broader questions of automated forms of surveillance that are increasingly used with big data. And the form of the image of the human that is created, I think is also a really good question. It comes from Foucault as well, and to do with Foucault on subjectivity, you know, how the subject is formed. I think they're connected debates. Again, I think that it is actually argued better by Ian Hacking than by Foucault. I think Foucault is good, but I don't bow at the shrine of Foucault. I think he had some good things to say, but I'm not a go disciple. But I think his work is better expressed in Ian Hacking's work. And in a number of Ian Hacking's writings, I think he grasps the surveillance business in some ways better than Foucault. But yeah, that question too of how you relate the kind of big data image of the person or the group to not only the responsibility of the operator or the surveillance agent, but also how you relate it to the active agency of those who are laid up. I think it's a huge question for us. So yeah, great comment. Who's next on your list then?
Yes, I have a small comment about when we're talking about adiaphorization. I was thinking about war.
Yeah.
And what you went ahead of me, but I was thinking after the mention of the using of aviation and rocket technology in war, war changed completely. And because aviation was, from the beginning, was used for surveillance, and then, the distance of the pilot and the bombers, and they were not related with what we're doing. They were not seeing what they were doing.
Yeah.
And like in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they threw the bomb, and I saw the big light, and they went away, and they were celebrating and having beer after that. They didn't know what they were doing, and most of them never assumed responsibility. I have seen testimonies of them, and they still think that they did what they have to do. Others were more remorse and more, So since then, possibly since First World War, war changed completely, and the soldier wasn't there seeing what he was doing, and then the terms of responsibility changed completely because of technology.
Yeah, that's also, I think, tremendously important comment, and it made me think of something further in relation to what you mentioned, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was also completely avoidable, but not only that, it was in no sense necessary. Those were experiments to see what would happen when you dropped those things. They were not necessary to the war effort. So if you look at the arguments about Nagasaki and Hiroshima, there are many who take, of course, the American military views that it was necessary, but actually Japan had already lost.
And surrendered.
And surrendered. It was completely unnecessary. So why did it happen? Because they were trying something out. And that is also something that Snowden seems to hint at. That we do some of these things because it's possible, not because it's desirable, morally right, or anything else, or even necessary for some greater cause, some greater good. And I think that is another thing that we ought to confront in our own studies and acknowledge that there is, well, acknowledge how huge is the temptation to try something just because we can do it. Because those people that perished in a second,
That's the American spirit, I guess.
Nagasaki and Hiroshima, perished in a second because somebody wanted to try to find out what happened when we did something. But the same thing is true with big data approaches. You listen to the people who are doing data analytics, and they're all about, well, what happens if we just move this? And a completely different configuration appears.
It's what you said before, it's pure calculation in the American work culture.
Yes.
It's just calculation.
Yeah. Now, I don't want to go further than I should on that point. I obviously, for the sake of the argument, I was making a clear distinction between the American school and the British school, and I was simplifying the complexity. But nonetheless, if you read what they were saying in the Macy conferences, really, Donald Mackay, who was the leader of the British school, was adamant. You can never have information that does not relate to some human meaning. He would not budge from that. He was a very fierce Scottish person. I actually met him in the 1970s and I had some good interactions with him, but I was always... He was very critical of the work that I was doing in the 1970s. But I did know him a little bit and I respected him. An American school led by Claude Shannon and what was his name, Weaver. Anyway, they argued that information could be reduced to sort of physical communication of signals. And they talked about noise, and it was reduced to something that could not be associated, in their view, with meaning. And of course, the extension from that is if you can quantify it and incorporate everything in what is quantified without reference to meaning, and also if the corporations can make money out of it, you can commodify it as well, then this is okay, this is information. So, yeah, it's a more complicated argument than I was making it, but nonetheless, the division was clear between the British and the American school. Myself, I think that the American school was profoundly wrong in its conclusion, but, you know, they were people in telecommunications, in neural communications. They were really very high-level scientists, so I'm dumbing down their argument for the sake of just making a point. But the point is relevant, as I said, because it underlies that metadata versus personal data argument. So governments after Snowden said, this is not surveillance because it's not personal data. It's metadata. It's when the call was made. It's who was contacted. It's how long the call was for. It's who's on the address list of this person using some social media platform. Those aren't personal data. Well, concatenated with the other data, they're super personal. In fact, Snowden himself says that the NSA rightly prefers metadata to content. So they prefer to get the metadata because you can do more with it. And also, they say, because metadata can't lie, whereas content can deceive others, can be self-deceptive, can be all sorts of things because it's real life. But metadata is just data. It's quantifiable stuff. And so the NSA people want the metadata because they think it gives, once you've created those algorithms that give you the results that you want, it's more accurate depictions, they say, of the people involved and the groups involved. But one needs to look at it alongside things like the debate over whether Google is a better source of knowing where the next flu epidemic is than the, what's the thing called? The Public Health Agency.
CDC.
What's it called?
CDC, Center for Disease Control.
Exactly. Center for Disease Control. So there's this big debate over whether the Center for Disease Control knows best where the next flu epidemic is going to be, or whether Google does. And the debate is a very interesting one, because it shows that Google does not always get it right, and sometimes those people who fool about in the Center for Disease Control actually have a better handle on it. I don't know if you saw this, but it was a debate in Nature and American from Scientist or somewhere, I can't remember the places. So you have to think about it in terms of, well, if that can be so inaccurate, in fact, and of course Google gives you some interesting results for where the flu might break out, but it's limited, for one thing, to people who have access to Google. The Center for Disease Control isn't dependent upon those who actually log on to Google to find out whether the symptoms that they have could be some strain of influenza. It is limited by all kinds of things, in fact, and you have to think about that before you agree that metadata is really a crucial way of finding out something accurately. And when you see the debate over Google and flu, then you begin to question quite how far the NSA is correct to be so heavily dependent on metadata, which they say is preferable to content surveillance.
I was thinking that the argument of the metadata fund operates like what is bureaucracy in traditional politics. Its political efficacy is that you always can say nobody is behind this, because well that was something that was produced by the system itself, so nobody is behind.
Yeah, that's the Werner von Braun syndrome, isn't it? Not my department. What happens to the bomb? It's not my department.
Not my department.
Yeah, I just made the thing. Not my department. What you do with this bomb? Yeah. So that's fine. I don't have to give the rest of my talk.